parents, the child goes to the teacher who will guide that child.
What do you mean by external moral authority? You use that expression a lot.
Materialism has to do with when you are
Hello, welcome back to the course in Values and Spirituality. Today we are looking at challenges to values and specifically the problems that teachers face in the education system in India. I'd like to welcome Sister Denise back to the studio.
Thank you.
Sister Denise, you start off on a very powerful note that the challenges that confront education in human values are similar to those that face education in general, and then you go into the list of challenges that the teachers face. Could you tell us why it is that you felt it important to include this at the beginning of this segment?
Well, it's very important because we're looking at the infrastructure and the external arrangements for learning, where you have, well, the first one on the list, social disparity between attitudes of the rich towards the poor, and that is that, well, the rich can have very good arrangements for education, so good. The poor don't need it. It's not an egalitarian society, and so part of that is because of the ideas connected with karma. So if a person is born in a situation where they are deprived of many things, including the arrangements for their education, well, that's because they deserved it. We look at philosophy of karma in a very different way from the traditional sense, which says, well, if you're in a bad situation, well, you created it for yourself, and if I'm in a good situation, then it means my karma is good. It's how we look at our karma as we do it that we give importance to here. So the lowest paid teachers will be teaching the students of the poorest, which means they'll be the lowest quality. Classrooms will be overfull, facilities will not be there. It'll be very difficult for the teachers to create an atmosphere of learning in the classroom situation. So all of these things conspire to create a situation where study about things that are not specifically academic or specific for passing exams, such as values and so on, they are given the third priority or the last priority. Facilities, computers, all of the things that are there in wealthy schools will not be there in poor schools. One point that's quite important, if you have poor nutrition, lack of sleep and exercise, whether you're a teacher or a student, you're not going to be able to learn very well. And so both the teachers and the students are facing these problems. And then what's mentioned as personal problems in the lives of teachers and students, which mitigate against a good educational environment. And the one that comes after this list is that of no political will. So unless the society in general gives it importance, the state gives it importance. I mean, why would you spend money on people who are not important, quote unquote, when you could spend it on other things that are of a higher priority? So in that sense, we would say it's a matter of getting your priorities straight in the first place. And when you're looking at education in values, you're also looking at the value of education. It's extremely high, but you know, here we're seeing it, it's like it's a luxury to have a good education. And then in terms of some of the research and commissions and so on, something that is someone's right has been positioned as a luxury. And we've been looking at the rights of students, the rights of people to have this, and we find that the circumstances do not allow a person to enjoy their rights. And this is why it requires political will to ensure that there is access to one's rights. But I think, again, the question of corruption in the educational environment plays a part. And I mean, I've seen in different parts of India, different parts of the world, wherever there is lack of financial resources, the condition of the educators and the students is really bad.
What I want to do now is to take you through the 5 bullets that are contained on page 100. You speak about the social disparity and the attitude of the rich towards the poor. Could you take us through that and also the rest one by one, but specifically, what do you mean and how does it affect, well, I assume you're speaking about the effect on poor children. How does it affect the poor?
One aspect is preservation of the status quo. And the status quo is that the poor are in the service of the rich. So that means the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And then what that means is once you get a gap between rich and poor of a certain size, then you get destabilization of the society. And this, I think, people don't realize. So things are done to increase that gap. Then you have an unstable society. Then you get social conflict. And then you have a breakdown of the infrastructure, a breakdown of the society altogether. Then you have to go back to square one and start again. So I think the problem here is just lack of understanding and, well, we could say lack of education, because the things that are studied don't really inform the people in such a way that they can work towards a society that is stable and sustainable. And I'm not talking about that an egalitarian society is ideal. I don't believe that, because I don't believe that people are equal. I believe people are very different. But I also believe that the nature of the hierarchy has to be such that it's balanced and that there isn't exploitation.
Yeah, and there's, unfortunately, the opposite is the case in this country.
On the whole, yes.
Okay, this next one is a somewhat painful subject: undervalued and underpaid teachers.
Well, again, society doesn't really want the children and the young people to have what they will call an unfair advantage. I would call it a fair advantage. Anything that brings the society into balance and keeps the relationship between the privileged and the underprivileged more favorable, you can say, people would be afraid of, because they're afraid they might lose out on something. There's an unwillingness to be generous. Philanthropy is a very important attribute of the philosophy of karma. And a wealthy person who creates schools, universities, provides books, and so on, is a great asset in a society. Now, if you're assuming that those who are fortunate will look favorably on those who are less fortunate and act accordingly, that's nice. But people very often don't do that. They would rather just gather the riches to themselves and disregard what happens when you create a greater imbalance in society. Now, when you give very low pay to teachers, it means you're going to draw into the profession the people who can't command a big salary. That means they'll be underqualified, they will not have much in the way of skills, and they will do their work grudgingly. Maybe they will not do the work adequately, they will not provide what we would like a teacher to provide for the students. And so the whole thing creates like a machine that really mitigates against the underprivileged. Now, if you suddenly say, okay, we're going to give great importance to the teachers and create a culture of education, as is there in some places in the world, it changes things completely. So I would like to see more of that. But unfortunately, it depends on the political will, the will of the people.
So the next aspect I'd like to take up is bullet number 3, competing educational priorities such as facilities and research.
One example you can point the finger at is the man Zuckerman wanted to create accessibility to the internet for free so that poor people can inform themselves. But the other internet companies are blocking that. So here you have an example of someone who wants to do an act of philanthropy for the educational benefit of the underprivileged, but the competitors can and do block it. Who suffers? Those who have rights but don't have the power to claim those rights. There's only so much technology and research and so on to go around, so it tends to be given to those who have it already, not to those who need it. So again, you have a situation where those who are benefited get more benefited, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. You get an imbalance. It creates a crisis situation, a collapse of the infrastructure, and everybody pays.
Let's go to the last aspect that you take up, which is personal problems in the lives of student and teachers. To what extent does this affect the quality of education delivered?
Well, personal problems can take the form of dysfunctional family life for the students and potentially for the teachers as well. Alcoholism is very substantial in the poor communities. Domestic violence is very evident, and when you have these attributes of a dysfunctional family life, it actually causes the child to go into a sort of intellectual lockdown, and they're unable to study. And this is something that nobody much cares about. They don't think it has anything to do with it. When there's insufficient nutrition, I mean, a child, many children go to school hungry. How can your brain operate when you're hungry? You see. So, and also teachers who are very poorly paid, they're in survival themselves, and so it all escalates, and it really is a big challenge to the development of people who are well equipped to go into their adult life.
You start off the next paragraph on a very strong note, and when I read the first few lines, I must say I winced. Perhaps the most fundamental and insidious challenge, you say, is that there seems to be no political will to solve these problems in education. Many political leaders seem unconcerned about the ignorant and illiterate masses. Really?
You know, life is very competitive. And India is a place of very, very high population, very high unemployment, and education gives you an edge in the question of employment, so that if you keep a huge section of the community at a disadvantage, then there's less competition for those who are in a privileged position, and they want to keep it that way. That's the problem. It really comes down to selfishness, which is an indicator of lack of spiritual strength, lack of spiritual wealth, no generosity. I think generosity is a very important instrument that feeds a society, but where there's no generosity, where you just do whatever you can to keep your political edge or your commercial edge in a competitive environment, that kind of karma is actually negative karma. And so if you see how things come around and go around, it causes everything to go down. But I do also see one very, very good situation is that if you have someone who is really underprivileged, who comes from a poor family, but shows brilliance, academic brilliance, there are instruments in place for discovering such ones and then giving them all the opportunities to come to the top of their profession. And whenever I see something like that, I really feel very heartened, and that is definitely there.
You end off by saying, once education becomes compulsory and universal, people will become conscious of their rights and might resist exploitation and might elect leaders on the basis of character, on intellectual and moral excellence, rather than on regional bias and religion. What do you mean by that? The last aspect?
In some countries, elections are such that an individual, elects who they want, and it's secret. But in many countries, elections are done by blocks of people. And in countries where the group is more important than the individuals, then there's a great deal of corruption around the process of election campaigning and so on. So that people will find ways to get large numbers of people to elect them by coercion. And so they will sometimes appeal to regional bias and religion. And in the group consciousness, there's very little sense of individual choice. When you have people in positions of power, they're in power not so that they can be of benefit to the people who need it, but power is for the self. And so the circumstances, the conditions of the world today are such that people desire power so that they can increase their own personal wealth and influence, and who suffers is the illiterate masses. And this is the problem, this huge disparity. One thing that we see in India is there's been a great deal of financial gain, and India has become really quite wealthy in terms of the world. But there's only a particular class of people who's benefited from that. And the large number of underprivileged and undereducated people have not seen any advantage of that, which means the disparity between rich and poor is really increasing exponentially. And the danger is that brings social unrest big time. And who is going to pay for it? Everybody.
In terms of what is contained in the 5 bullets, I see that you emphasize the importance of undervalued and underpaid teachers, poor nutrition and lack of sleep and exercise, and personal problems in the values of students and teachers. Are you saying that the way society functions at the moment, these factors are severely ignored and underemphasized, and had more attention been paid to all of these factors, the education system would be vastly improved?
I think that people in power have the possibility to do something about it, but because they themselves are spiritually depleted and weak, they use their positions of privilege only to take care of themselves, their family, and enhance this social disparity. It's a matter of choice, isn't it? If you're in a position of power and you have wealth, you can do with it what you want. But if you use it because you're personally insecure or because you're weak to shore up your own self, then this is what happens. And this is the environment that we're in now. So I would say that overall, in the entire landscape, there is a poverty in terms of spiritual power, which is across the board, from the most underprivileged to the most privileged. And this situation, which is an invisible situation, very intangible, but this is what is bringing the society to breaking point, actually.
Okay, so tell us how one accumulates spiritual power, since that's where the problem arises.
Well, you accumulate spiritual power by giving the highest value to your relationship with the divine and drawing spiritual power into yourself, which means you have a very different view of what you are, of the importance of bringing God or the divine into the picture, and of your sense of responsibility to the underprivileged. And this is there in the textbooks, but not in practical reality, you see. And this is the sign of lack of spiritual wealth across the board.
Sister Denise, if it's so obvious to you, why is it not so obvious to everyone?
I think that materialism has blinded people. So I also think that anyone who sees the reality of this situation, all they simply have to do is fill themselves and start to perform that karma that, causes maximum benefit to maximum people. And if they're going to do that, they're going to gradually come into a position of power and influence. And from that position, with that mentality and attitude, they will then bring benefit and rebalance the society. And this is something, in terms of the philosophy of karma, somebody who starts doing this over several lifetimes, you won't see this because you can't see what's happening between one lifetime and another and who comes into a position of power and influence through their pure karma. But I do feel that our current society is seeing a little bit of an effect of this, and that people who are really motivated by social benefit are coming into that position of power. So you're getting two strands. One is this absolute breakdown of society through materialism, vices, spiritual poverty. Then on the other hand, a less visible new growth, you can say, of spiritual wealth. And I think as time goes by, this is going to become more obvious. And I'm hoping that a course like this is going to be a matter of attraction for people who are interested in this sort of thing, and it will help such a person to come into position in that way.
I like the way that Sister Denise took up the 5 bullets that are contained on page 100, and the way she went through them makes it very obvious that this is a very real challenge facing India today, not just this country, the globe itself. I do hope that you found something in today's course that was of some benefit to you and that resonated with you. So take care and goodbye.